Welcome, everybody. I think we may have a few folks still coming in, but I'm going to try to get us going here. You'll see some slides go by. Talk, I think, 2 weeks from now, right? Yeah. Carly Spinarski, a really cool talk, relatively new faculty member. And there's another one up for next Monday, which is Doug Brooks. It'll come up in a second. He's the author of the book Statesman, which is the wonderful biography of George Mitchell. And in fact, I think he's going to bring some copies of it, right? So if you don't have a book, I already do, you can pick it up from him when he's here. So I thought I'd just say a little bit about Yellow Breen, who's come today. It's really wonderful to have him here. Pretty well known to a lot of people, but in case somehow you haven't heard much about his background, he grew up in St. Albans, so not very far from here. Is that you?
No, it's the heater.
Oh, the heater, good. Something. It's always something. Grew up, in fact, without electricity or running water on a back-to-the-land homestead, which was actually the way a lot of people ended up in Maine. He's a product of Maine public schools, but also with degrees in government and law from Harvard, and in fact returned to Maine, as it'll be pretty evident today, wanting to make a difference, and he's been at it for some time. Really diverse background, which I think is a great strength in things like business, public policy, and law. In the public sector, he worked in Angus King's administration, including especially the laptop initiative. In the private sector as a senior executive at Bangor Savings, and for the last 18 months or so at Maine Development Foundation, which, again, a really fascinating organization. One of the phrases off the web there is driving sustainable long-term economic growth in Maine, stimulating new ideas, developing leaders, and providing common ground for solving problems and advancing issues, including public economic research to inform public policy. Together with the Maine Economic Growth Council, MDF prepares the annual measures of growth support, which, by the way, Phyllis brought some stuff, and that report is back there, so feel free to pick that up. Come to think of it, there's also pins, which I don't usually wear pins, but this one was irresistible. It says civility. I was inclined to say something really rude about people putting civility pins in the back, but then I thought, no, I shouldn't be doing that. He's been deeply involved, his organization and him personally, in the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration's work in Maine. I don't know exactly when it all happened, but a lot of it happened in August when many federal agencies were here as part of this request by Senators King and Collins to have them come up and look at some of the big challenges in the forest products industry. So there's a report that was issued by the Maine Forest Economy Growth Initiative earlier this month, and there was a really thoughtful commentary piece in the Bangor Daily News in mid-January on which Yellow was one of the authors. And in fact, the title of it is Time for Maine's Forest Products Industry to Reinvent Itself, and Here's How. I was going to say that his work with Angus King reminded me, I thought, well, we got a lot of good ideas from Angus King, and I was trying to remember when. It turns out about 10 years ago, so about January 20th, 2007, we had a 2-hour conversation in this room back when it couldn't be heated, and snow blew under the doors over there. I kid you not. With Angus King, in between when he'd been governor and before he was senator, where we just brainstormed with him. He was very generous with us to help us think about what the Mitchell Center could or should be doing. I actually have my notes from the meeting, which run to 17 pages, and I brought a big notepad for Yellow's talk, and I figure I'll probably go to 30 or 40 maybe. But what I remember about Angus King's talk, one of my favorite things was, because it was a two-way conversation, as you'd expect, so we were telling him a bit about what we hope to do to engage with stakeholders, to focus on solving real problems, to bring the diverse expertise and capacities of a research university to bear on this, including these interdisciplinary collaborations. And at some point, he just got way excited and he said, I just wish I'd had something like the Mitchell Center when I was governor. And I thought, well, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. And so that's my segue here, is that here we have Yellow. He's a big advocate for leadership development, for finding common ground, for evidence-based decision-making, for creating a brighter future for the people of Maine. When I thought about all that, I thought, well, that sounds an awful lot like the Mitchell Center. And in fact, that's exactly why we wanted to have him here today, is that there's, we think, wonderful opportunities to explore the collaborative space between the great work he's now doing at his organization and all the wonderful stuff that goes on here and across campus. So please join me in welcoming Yellow.
Thanks, David. I used to start every talk by saying the answers are yes, no, and I don't know. And, what are the questions? Is Yellow Light your real name? Yes. Are you Native American? No. Hippie? And what were your parents smoking at the time? I don't know. I can't say that anymore because my mom got mad. She said, my mom's a midwife, and she said, everybody knows you're not supposed to smoke when you're pregnant. So I said, okay, Mom, I think they know it's a joke. It's a real privilege to be here at anything named after George Mitchell. George Mitchell was my political hero growing up in central Maine, and had a chance to intern in his office in 1992, and I'll come back to a little bit about what I learned from George Mitchell at the end maybe of my presentation. So a year and a half ago, I took a 50% pay cut, added about 3 hours a day to my daily commute in order to take this job at this nonprofit, the Maine Development Foundation. Are you really that crazy passionate about what MDF does? Yes, I am. It's a pretty unique thing. And MDF was created about 40 years ago by state government, but it was deliberately created to be outside of state government. And by design, we're a membership organization. A lot of private sector companies and nonprofits are members, and our board has to be 50% for-profit and 50% nonprofit and government, including 2 members of the governor's cabinet. So we keep that tie back to the state. We're a classic public-private partnership. But our mission is to work on long-term economic development strategy for the state of Maine across sectors. If it's short-term, someone else has got it. If it's easy to do, someone else can work on it. If one sector could tackle it, have at it. So really, we're only getting involved when it's something that is pretty thorny, pretty big picture, and is definitely statewide. And that really fits my passion about this state. I grew up in rural Maine over in Somerset County, but working at a statewide company, I got to see every corner of the state. And I don't think it's mutually exclusive to love one corner of this state over another. It's just amazing what's going on across the state, and I'll speak to that a little bit. We do a lot of different things at the Maine Development Foundation, and one of the things we pushed ourselves on last year was how do you even articulate what all of our programs have in common? And I think any complex institution has that challenge. And for us, we boiled it down to just these 3 things that all of our programming and initiatives and research have in common. It's about leadership, it's about trusted research, and it's about creative cross-sector partnerships to move the state forward. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we see those things playing out in the state and in our work. Maine's economic context first. It requires brutal honesty and unquenchable optimism. I put this on a slide last August, and it was quoted in the Bangor Daily News. First time I've ever had a PowerPoint quoted in the newspaper, so I said, all right, I better keep using this slide. And so what we've been known for is, as David said, this signature product over the last 22 years. And I was talking with a woman from Washington County who was on the original Growth Council back in the early to mid-90s, and she said, you know, don't take this for granted. You take it for granted now, but at the time, the notion that we could get a politically unfiltered view of what was really going on in the Maine economy was a rather elusive thing. Statewide elections were fought and won and lost based on, various kind of partisan slants on how was the economy even fundamentally doing, and was it up or down, and who could take credit for it. So she said, don't take this for granted. And what I love inside the front cover is this pictograph, which long predates me. And I love it because it speaks to a holistic vision of what the economy is about. And it says, look, while we talk a lot about the economy, none of us are in this for the sake of growing the economy for its own sake. We're in it because it's really about the quality of life for Maine people. We know we have to have a prosperous economy in order to support that, but we also have to have a healthy environment and vibrant communities. And if you don't have any of the three, what is the point of doing this work? And indeed, it's that delicate balancing act between those three that really defines success and makes this work really challenging and rewarding. I often like to say, if we are disagreeing about the really big important things, then I feel good about this state and about our society, right? East-West Highway, fundamentally different conceptions of what the trade-offs are worth around our communities in order to maybe create a new piece of infrastructure or a new economic asset. And regardless of your position on that kind of issue, if we're arguing over the right things, that's what's important. So where do we stand? First, a little bit of the good news. We always award gold stars in this report. And 2 of the 3 gold stars this year are around environmental measures. And I highlight this one just because it's so dramatic. Maine is in those white lines at the top. The nation, you see, is mired in the middle of the graph. And as you know, probably as students, researchers, scholars, you hardly ever see this kind of division, this kind of gap in a data set. I mean, that is beyond enormous to say that Maine is consistently at 90-95% of the highest ratings of water quality versus the nation being at 30 to 45%. So our calling card in terms of the environment here is significant, and increasingly it's going to be a signature economic asset for this state. How we leverage that both for economic opportunity and to preserve the quality of life that will draw people here, it's going to be ever more rare. Clean water, as you know, will be one of the most rare economic assets in the world and even in North America. This one will probably surprise a lot of you who think about these things. We gave a gold star to the cost of doing business in Maine. Why would you do that? This is a famously high cost place to do business. But when you look at the long-term trend, Maine being in the white dotted line, you can see the long-term trend is down on a relative basis, both towards the nation and going from the worst in New England, most notably, to the second cheapest cost of doing business in New England. That's extremely dramatic. And I think the Growth Council's feeling is unless you celebrate progress and success, you're not going to continue the hard work that it takes to move long-term trends in that kind of direction. And so they gave it a gold star. I always like to say this. Look, we are a high-cost state in a high-cost region in a high-cost country on the globe. We're not going to win based on having the lowest cost of doing business. It's a question about what other assets do we have that we can leverage in order to prosper. All right, so now the brutal honesty. What were the red flags? Every year we assign red flags in this report as well. What were some of them this year? A lot of them fundamentally tie back to this overarching metric, which is value added per worker, what we often think of as productivity, right? And Maine is the dotted line at the bottom of this chart. And indeed, over the last few years, we've typically been 51st out of the 50 states in the District of Columbia in this metric. And there's a lot of things bound up in that, right? It's partially about what kind of economic sectors predominate the Maine's economy and how productive those are on the margin. How do you drive greater productivity out of the tourism and hospitality sector, by way of example? How do you drive productivity out of any highly seasonal sector? There's a lot of things wrapped up in this in terms of can we make as much on the margin in the industries we have in Maine, and what is our mix of industries? But I would argue a lot of it goes to 2 fundamentals. One of them is this. 3 of the red flags were on education metrics. And I often get asked, well, does Maine have a good education system or a lousy one? Because Maine has made a lot of progress over the last 30 years in education. Around 2001, I went down to Washington, D.C. with my boss, and Maine was recognized as the highest performing state in the country in K-12 education. We do a lot of things right that we have to celebrate. And indeed, even on these graphs, you'll note that Maine in the white is equal to or slightly better than the national average, which is in green. But you also see that we persistently trail the region that we're in that we compete against. We consistently trail the orangish bar, which is the New England average, by about 15%. When you look at the gap between 39 and 46 some odd percent. So if we are in a high cost region of the world, but we're in a high productivity region of the world, a highly educated region of the world, and we're a laggard on that metric, how do we compete? That's a huge ongoing challenge for us as a state. So first takeaway from the research, we have to invest in our people. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Here's one of the other key red flags that I think also contributes to that productivity gap. This is R&D spending. You see Maine way over on the left at 1%. We're about 1/3 the national average. We trail our region. And most disheartening, that second leftmost bar is a group of other typically large rural states where they've been singled out specifically for their lack of basic research grants. And so there's kind of a special program at the NSF targeting those states called EPSCoR. We have one of them based here at the University of Maine, one of those grants, in order to try to prime the pump of basic research in those states. So we trail even that group of benchmark states of which we are a part. Years ago, about 15 years ago, then Governor King got sick of people speculating. What is it that explains the prosperity among states? Because, as he also loves to say, the plural of anecdote is data. And so everyone had a theory, right? A pet theory of like, well, whatever New Hampshire is doing, they just haven't made because on some of these metrics they're ahead of us. Or it's just about what's driving the growth in the Sun Belt and the Rocky Mountain states. It might even just be the fact that they're warmer and people want to live there. And he had the state planning office and the state economist look at every variable they could and try to explain the differences. So they took all the data from every state, and the only two variables out of scores that they looked at that had any kind of robust explanatory power about the differences in prosperity among states, one was the percentage of your population with a bachelor's degree or higher, and the other was your investment per worker in research and development. Just those, bachelor's attainment and R&D. And the cut points, the break points, kind of the place where you could see a material difference in prosperity, 30% bachelor's degree and $1,000 per worker in R&D spending. 30 and 1,000 was the name of the report. I love it because it's so simple. Even I can remember it after 15 years, 30 and 1,000. The 30 has gone up a little bit. The 1,000 has gone up even more, right? And as other states have continued to invest in those two things. But I do a lot of work around education reform and education policy, and we frequently get trapped into this loop where people say, are you saying that every person in our workforce in our society needs a higher education degree? No, it was 30% back in 2000, 2001. Today we think even when you throw in associate's degrees and credentials that it's about 60% of our workforce. It's not 100%, but it's a significant leap from where we are today. So that's the second point. Invest in our people and create a climate for investment and innovation in the state, and that will drive our prosperity forward in a significant way. So we take those insights from the research and then ask ourselves, all right, what kind of programming or policy can we engage in and promote that will move this forward? And I want to touch a little bit on how we do that and how we see that. So how do we use leadership, trusted research, and cross-sector partnerships to try to move those research insights into the policy dialogue and into systems change and community change? So a lot of our focus is on leadership. What do we do to unleash the full potential of leaders? And so one of our signature programs is called Leadership Maine. And it's an effort, the original goal was 1,000 leaders. We passed that goal last year. We've now gone from Alpha to Omega. We're in our 24th class. Taking leaders from every sector. It's a class about 40 a year. And we have private sector leaders and CEOs. We have executive directors of nonprofits. We have policymakers. We have administrators and leaders in higher ed. And exposing them to the assets. We start off with some team building, by the way. create a culture within that. But we show them the examples, the assets, the anchor points across the state in different sectors and different regions and how they vary. And some of you have probably seen the research at Jackson Lab firsthand, but if you haven't, it's just extraordinary. And there's no replacement for seeing it and hearing firsthand from not only what they're doing in oncology research, let's say, but how they're doing behavioral research in mice to inform our work and our treatment of autism, and the way they can isolate an autism gene in mice, and then in turn figure out what those behaviors are and what combination of behavioral modification and pharmacology might affect those genes. It's pretty amazing stuff going on just down the road in Bar Harbor, Maine. We visited the blueberry barrens. What's a more traditional, basic legacy industry than growing a wild blueberry? You can't, by definition, do much to it, or it's not a wild blueberry anymore, right? And yet they've managed to quadruple the productivity of those blueberry barons over the last 40 years. And nothing like being on a bus. That's Dave Yarborough from the Cooperative Extension Service. The class was just blown away by the idea that someone spent 43 years of their life trying to figure out how to drive innovation and grow a better blueberry. And we met these young UMaine grads who were the ones responsible, right, for creating the satellite guided robotic systems that are doing the integrated pest management on these blueberry barons. Quite eye-opening. Or the research that's being done to try to accelerate and bring back elements of the shellfish industry in Maine and help us diversify as we're seeing the climate pressure, for example, on lobsters. Can we create these new revenue streams now instead of waiting until it's too late? And yes, Virginia, there's a new paper mill being built. Actually, just opened last fall. We saw it when it was still under construction. A new paper mill that was built in down East Maine. The tissue market is growing. If you think about the use of Kleenex and toilet paper and feminine hygiene products across the third world that wasn't using those products before, newsprint is going away, but tissue is growing, in some cases, geometrically. We went to the Bates Mill in Lewiston. You can't really imagine it, but this is a mill complex that is 4 acres on each floor. And it was slated for demolition until a young architect in Lewiston went to the city council with her peers and said, this place defines the community in which we grew up. You need to give us a reprieve in order to create a vision that can move this redevelopment forward. And now they're finally on the cusp of fully renovating and reusing this enormous anchor space in downtown Lewiston. One of the tenants nearby, by the way, one of our greatest and funnest growth sectors in Maine, which is the microbrew and craft brew industry. And we even take them and give them a day in the legislature, because the other question is, how do you take these insights, whether they're driven by research or whether they're driven by experiential learning, how do you bring these insights into policy? And so we take these leaders from across the state into the House chamber in Augusta. It's coming up a week from Friday, and give them a sense of what it's really like to be a freshman legislator. We've had people out of the class turn around and run for the legislature, in some cases the same year that they had this experience, in other cases down the road. But innovation is everywhere. If you haven't been over to the little Mount Abram community ski area in western Maine and what they're doing, and it's a win-win, right? Because what's the biggest cost element of running a ski area? It's electricity to drive snowmaking and lifts. And if you can come up with a way to control your cost and to use innovation to drive down your utilization of energy, it's such a huge, huge win-win. And what they've cottoned to is it's also a signature brand differentiator for you in doing business in the marketplace as well. And then to go see how they build billion-dollar ships at Bath Iron Works is always a pretty extraordinary way to wrap up the year. And how they have to, both how they have to innovate in their technology, but also innovate in the culture of their workforce in order to remain in business today. Pretty striking what we heard there. So we march these 1,000 leaders over the last 24 years through a journey to try to arm them. When I first took this job, there's a lot of lingo in philanthropy, and some of the lingo, is about collective action theories of change versus network theories of change. Like, what the heck does that mean? And I gradually realized that Leadership Maine is a network theory of change. The 1,000 of us aren't working together every day or every week, but we've created this dispersed network of people who share an insight and an ability to collaborate around the important issues. And we do the same thing for the Maine legislature. Policy Leaders Academy is one of our other signature programs. We don't get to take them on a year-long journey. We only get a few days. But a couple of weeks ago, we took them across a journey from Bangor up to Presque Isle to Millinocket and back, and showed them signature assets and challenges of the communities that are moving forward or struggling with change. And as the state treasurer said to me, look, if it wasn't for MDF and the Policy Leaders Academy, the state legislature would get no professional development at all. So that's a burden that we take pretty seriously, to say, how can we leverage that with our partners, which are shown there, to really expose them to what's going on. We've got an all-day policy summit for them coming up on February 8th around economic policy issues. We do a lot of other sort of short-form, quick hits with them around different key policy issues. And a lot of that goes to this issue of how do you create sustainable policy and sustainable change. And I'll come back to that in my wrap-up. This is them at CNL Aerospace down at the Bangor International Airport. 200 employees down there now, repairing and maintaining short-haul regional airlines and private jets from across the world. How do we work to unleash the potential of people across the state, and not just those who are in leadership positions? It goes back to that fundamental: invest in people and prosperity will follow. So we're part of something over the past year called Maine's Workforce and Education Coalition. I like to tell people, it's kind of unfair for MDF to be touting how collaborative we are, because it's in our structural DNA to be collaborative. Collaboration is a hard thing. And maybe a lot of our conversation will focus on why is it hard and how can we make it less hard. So we're working with a cast of characters from across the higher ed system, Maine adult education, employers, you name it. I think there's another slide I don't have that has the full list of some 20 plus organizations that have signed on to this effort, and many more that we think will sign on to it. And the fundamental premise is this: we have to do two things in the face of our demographics. We have to sustain and grow our workforce in this state. That's kind of the middle element of these funnels. And we have to dramatically increase the percentage of our population with a post-secondary credential of value. And that includes industry certificates, that includes OJT, that includes a host of things. My colleagues at the Chinbro Corporation are very fond of constantly reminding us of the fact that all of their crane operators make more than most of us. And so there has to be a recognition that these are not all degree credentials in the end. The national definition, by the way, of a credential of value, I think, is any credential that commands a wage premium 20% higher than a high school diploma alone. So it's got to be something that you can't just put on your resume, but it actually provides economic value in the marketplace. That is a big number. 158,000 additional workers in Maine with a post-secondary credential. My suspicion is that probably we generate half of that just through the good work of the systems that are in place. And the other half is probably that step change, that sea change that we somehow need to drive together. So that just explains that number. A lot of our work focuses on adult learners, probably because structurally it's the place where our systems are the weakest, right? We have a huge K-12 system in this state with leadership from the Maine Department of Education and the State Board of Education and lots of statewide policy. But the adult ed system in Maine isn't really a system. It's a scattered set of 100 or so adult ed sites, many managed by a part-time person whose real day job is something else. And so a lot of our work focuses on this fact that college kids aren't always kids. And moving probably 75 to 80% of our progress on that overall education attainment goal is going to be from adults who are already in the workforce, not from working with traditional age students who might be in the 6th to 14th grade pipeline today. So this is one of our big challenges. This is a worldwide challenge, by the way. It's not a Maine challenge. We get caught up in the demographics of Maine being the oldest state in in the nation, statistically speaking. But this is a huge problem in Europe. It's a huge problem in Japan. It's a huge problem across the U.S. It's just that it's more dramatic. It's more severe here in Maine. So that's the decline in our workforce, and that's the increase that we think we'd like to see. This data is a little bit older than the data on that other slide. And you guys have seen this phenomenon for the first time in our history. We have no natural increase. And what we found when we started to dig in on this issue, and we have in the back kind of the précis of a longer report on immigration and Maine's workforce. The 50 largest metro areas in the U.S., none of them are growing population except for the influence of immigration. So the idea that we think we could somehow grow our workforce without the influence and the benefit of immigration is just lunacy. And you see, kind of that effect of the baby boomers. But this really shocked me. We think that Maine is getting older because we're getting older. Right? Well, it sounds obvious. Of course Maine is getting older because we're getting older. But actually, we're not getting older as fast as the country is getting older. So the fact that we are the oldest state demographically and getting older than the nation is not because we have more old people who are moving into the ranks of old people more. It's because we don't have anybody over here. And that's where the influence of the immigrant population in the United States is being felt, that's helping to offset that. And we have nothing to offset it. So we're getting older not because we're getting older, but because we don't have any younger people coming in on the other end to help us out. I don't say any. There's a lot of you in this room. We don't have enough, right? We don't have enough. And you can boil all the statistics and all the data down, and this is the one that gets me the most. When you look at that 15-year trend, the number of people 16 to 64, sort of traditional potential working age people, 3 to 1 today compared to over 65, falling to 2 to 1. That is a crushing burden if, like me, you expect to still be in the workforce 15 years from now, right? So we need to get more people in. Part of what we're going to do is we're going to make seniors work longer, some because they want to and some because they have to, right? So that's going to be part of what will chip away at this demographic. Part of it is we're going to have to be a lot more productive. We're going to have to generate a lot more economic output for every one of us that's still working in 2032. And we're going to have to get immigrants into the state in numbers that we haven't in recent years. So that's why we put out this report with the State Chamber of Commerce. And the report, by the way, isn't about federal immigration policy, despite the events of the last 3 or 4 days. It's about getting our fair share in the state of the immigration that does occur. Our share of the national pool of immigrants is smaller than New Hampshire's, smaller than Idaho's, smaller than Minnesota's. So regardless of what that pool is, how do we make this a welcoming and economically viable place where immigrants want to be? I guess I think about it this way. You work on the right issues for the right reason, and the context around you sometimes politicizes those issues. And that's not our aim. It just happens to be the environment that we're living in, and that's the way it works. And finally, on this immigration issue, look at this. The percent foreign-born in Maine versus New England in the U.S. 3.5 versus 12 or 13. So again, it's not necessarily about outdoing our peer states or the country, but how would we close that gap between where we are and where they are? And by the way, this wasn't always true. 50 or 60 years ago, the percent of foreign-born in Maine was higher than the nation. So the idea that this somehow is a break from our heritage is also not true. It's not easy, but it's not true. And I will add, by the way, that what's also not true, my first reaction, and maybe yours sometimes in thinking about this, is, yeah, but those generations of immigrants looked more like us. Yeah, you know how welcoming we were to the Franco-Americans and the Irish? And how we didn't treat them as distinctly second-class citizens? Well, unfortunately, we did, right? And so, yeah, the challenges are greater. but we faced those challenges before. Don't fool ourselves. And our penchant for creating that us versus them mentality, regardless of skin color, has been there in our own history, and we have to overcome that now the way we didn't then. All right, so what are some of the things we're working on to unleash the potential of communities and industries? We're talking about unleashing the potential of our people, but how do we also create that environment for investment in communities and industries? One of the programs we have, which I love, is the Maine Downtown Center. It's part of the National Main Street program, and we're working with dozens of communities across the state who are part of this program. And you can't really see it on this slide, but buried in the data set there, the reason I love this program is that the return on investment of this program is 23 to 1. The communities that are doing this full-fledged, the one with the gold stars on them, who are really all in on the full version of this national model, they spent about $11 million over the last 12 or 13 years on this program. About $100,000 per community per year. They've attracted almost $250 million in capital investment into their communities, over 900 buildings rehabbed, about 285,000 volunteer hours. And the magic of these programs is really where it is at the grassroots. The national model, like most successful models, if you read it, it's really simple. It's not rocket science. And it says a few things. One, it says that you need commitment from the municipality, the business community, and the residents. Sounds simple, but hard to create and even harder to sustain. You have to have equal funding from those three groups as proof that they're all committed. And they have to be equally involved in the leadership of these efforts. So it doesn't sink or swim when the town council turns over. It doesn't sink or swim on a few business leaders who have enough energy to volunteer on the festival this year. It has to have that broad base. And then the other thing about the program is you have to work on all of the elements simultaneously and with equal vigor. You have to work on organization of sustaining it. You have to work on promotions, that is your festivals and events and marketing your community as someplace that people want to live, work, and do business. You have to work on infrastructure and facades, the design element of how is your downtown designed, how does traffic flow, what does it look like, is it one way, is it roundabouts, etc. And then finally, business attraction and restructuring. What are the kinds of businesses that will thrive in your downtown, which is different than all other downtowns? So if you don't work on all four at once, with all three sectors at the same time being equally committed, it fails. It's really simple. It's just really dang hard to do. And the final big example of how we've been able to work lately to try to really leverage a sector to move forward has been our work with the forest products industry. This being Maine, I was literally sitting at Panera in Augusta minding my own business, and Senator King's chief of staff was at the next table, and she said, "Hey, we might have a project we need your help on." And so by the following Monday, I was on the phone with the staff from the entire congressional delegation. They said, "We asked the federal government to come in like they would after a natural disaster to respond to the closing of 6 paper mills, most of them here in the Penobscot Valley, plus Madison over in the Kennebec Valley." And what do the feds do after a natural disaster? They send in a multi-agency team and they come up with a coordinated response. And they said, "Well, we've asked them to come in. We're worried they will say yes, and there will be no one here to meet them." Will MDF take on that coordinating role and help really make their engagement productive and effective? And most importantly, it's a multi-year engagement to really track our progress and hold each other accountable for what we said we were going to do out of the project. So, this hasn't been easy for the affected communities when those smokestacks come down. And you can see the concentration of where the hit was, right, here in eastern Maine. So statewide, it was a significant hit, but in this region, it was just exponential. And you can see the impact, over $1 billion of economic activity lost in that top line, and over 5,000 jobs over just a 2-year period. That is dramatic. And yet, here's one of the critical things. It's still an $8 billion industry employing over 30,000 people. So the question is, how can you drive a future I mean, we're talking about driving a future out of industries like aquaculture that are a tiny fraction of 8 billion in the state today, right? And how do we drive their growth curve? Well, here's one that's already 8 billion. How do we sustain it and drive a growth curve for it? So everyone in the industry, not an industry that is prone to say, we like working with the federal government, they said, it's really bad, come on in. And they stayed unified, and that was really key, that the industry stayed unified. A town manager said this to me early on, no amount of federal money ever turned a bad plan into a good plan. And so the essence of what we set out to do is to say we have to come up with a coherent and shared vision of what this industry could be in Maine. And the kicker is everyone else is doing it, and we hadn't done it in Maine. And how are we going to stay on a competitive path if we don't have a sustained vision that we're executing against? So we worked with the industry and community leadership to stay at the table to come up with our own recommendations, and then in turn ask the feds to basically cut and paste those recommendations into the report that they released 2 weeks ago. Our goal to sustain the business we have, attract capital investment into innovation in that sector, and to support the communities. I mean, when you visit 6 mill towns in 3 days, it's evident to you that even if some of these towns are going to have a path forward that will still be closely linked to the forest products industry, many will not. Not every community will be able to. And what are they going to do to diversify and build the kind of communities they want? You can go to the website to look at our 9 priorities, so I won't get into that. But in essence, it's create a game plan. Create a business plan for this industry so that when we're trying to advocate for policy change, when we're trying to advocate for where to target our economic development incentives, and when we're going out pitching the state to potential investors in the private sector, we're actually pitching the right things in a really coherent, focused way, not each of our pet theories about what market to pursue, but actually driven by a hard-headed, hardcore assessment of that. And then on the community side, dealing with brownfields, reuse and remediation and reuse on these closed mill sites is a huge piece of it. And then so many strands that go into diversifying and strengthening the economy overall. We're really just getting rolling. You know, putting out a report like this doesn't make anything happen. It's just the end of the beginning in terms of saying, how do we leverage the fact that leaders stayed at the same table and that the congressional delegation has been relentless in supporting this? Now, how do we use that to get the right investments to move each strategy forward? We were able to announce some of those investments on day one, but a lot of them will take time. You may have seen the announcement last Friday of the partnership between UMaine and the Oak Ridge National Lab down in Tennessee, right? A lab that started with the Department of Energy as part of the Manhattan Project. Well, we don't know where that partnership is going to go. But 5 years from now, looking back, it could be the single most important thing that came out of this process, is this unbelievable opportunity to be an R&D hub for the future of how you use microscopic nanocellulosic wood fiber in order to make industrial products that we can't even imagine today. That's going to be part of the path forward. I mean, it starts with basic things like, well, maybe we can create wood-based polymers that we can 3D print into boat hulls. You know, think about Maine's international leadership in boat building and the chance to reinvent wooden boat building in a new way with new technology. There's lots of other things we can't even describe or explain or imagine that could come out of that sort of partnership. That's the kind of thing that we need for innovation in this industry. Building on that competitive advantage, we have 17 million acres of forest land in the state, commercial forest land in the state, and over half of it is certified as being sustainably managed and harvested. That's higher than any other place in North America. That's huge, right? So part of this is often about flipping the narrative. I mean, one of the hardest things about working with the forest products industry is that everyone assumes it's dead. So why would you spend a lot of time building a strategy for an industry that's dead? Why would you spend a lot of time thinking about how to attract innovation to an industry that's dead? So a huge part of our thought process is around recreating the context for the fact that there are parts of this industry that are really alive and have enormous future potential. And it ain't going to be what we imagine. It's going to be the kinds of things that are produced here at UMaine's research institutes, bio-based chemicals, plastics, materials, fuels. This notion of a biorefinery as opposed to a petrochemical refinery? What will come out of that entire constituent element? As the head of R&D for SAPI, which is one of the largest paper makers in the world, 7th largest factory in the world over in Skowhegan, the head of R&D there said, we're not in the business of making paper. We're in the business of manipulating the cellulosic fiber of wood. We just happen to make paper today. What else can we make over time? So it all comes back to, how do we leverage leadership, research, and cross-sector partnerships in order to move those kind of really challenging issues forward, some at a very grassroots level, right? Some at a very individual level in terms of investing in your future when it comes to education and the workforce, and some at a really thorny macroeconomic level, like a cluster development strategy for the forest products industry. So how do we use those things to move forward this holistic vision of what it means to have a strong economy? I want to speak to this other issue, this issue of civility, because how we do this work really matters. And this actually had its start when I was 2 weeks into the job, a couple of falls ago, and I got a call from a bunch of leaders in the Maine legislature. And they said, "Can we come over and talk to you?" I said, "Sure." They came over and they said, that stuff you do with us, the Policy Leaders Academy, where you give us all these seminars on economic policy and things like that? Really great stuff, really valuable. You know what's even more valuable right now and even more necessary right now? We need tools to work together across political divides, across the aisle. There's some really great national programming on this concept of civility and civil discourse. Will you help bring it to Maine and sponsor it for the Maine legislature? And we thought about it for a few seconds, and we said yes. And the reason we said yes, even though it's not strictly economic policy, is because we recognize that if you're working on anything really big and substantive, you have to have a sustainable consensus around that direction, because these things take 5, 10, 15 years in order to move the needle on progress. And to do that, you have to have a big center and a center that can hold. And to do that, you have to be able to work together in the right way over time. And so the state treasurer was in that meeting, and she had a lapel pin that said civility. And I was really coveting her civility pin, and I said, I wish I had one of those. And I got to the office the next morning, and there was a note card with her civility pin at my office, and she just said, "You're going to be seen around the state more than I am. You need to wear this civility pin and carry this message." And a couple of months later, I was talking to the Senate President, Mike Thibodeau, and he was coveting my civility pin. And he said, "Where can I get one of those?" I said, "Call Terry Hayes, the state treasurer." Well, she didn't have a pipeline to a supply, so I had to march over to the State House, and I gave Mike Thibodeau the civility pin off my lapel. And so Terry and I were joking, it was our flat Stanley civility pin that was going to tour the world and come back to us, like the things the kids do. So we ordered 1,000 more. We figured every legislator and every person who works with the legislature needed to have one of these. We ran out. We ordered 2,500 more. We're getting close to the end of that batch. But I have a civility pin for every one of you in the back of the room. I hope you will wear it. And if you run into someone who needs to wear it even more than you, pass it on and we'll get you a new one. And that is the anecdote I want to close on of what I learned when I worked for Senator Mitchell back as a 20-year-old college intern. I got roped in one day. There was a visiting group from the Knights of Columbus Ladies Auxiliary from Old Town, Maine, that came down to visit the senator. And I got roped into being one of the tour guides that took them around the entire Capitol complex for the better part of a day. And at the end of the afternoon, these ladies, median age, probably 70, I think there were 10 or 15 of them in the group, they had a small group audience with the majority leader of the United States Senate, George Mitchell. And the reason they were there was to present George Mitchell with a petition urging him to oppose abortion. George Mitchell has been a champion of reproductive rights his entire career, and indeed, as Senate Majority Leader, was the primary sponsor of something called the Freedom of Choice Act in the United States Senate. And here were some of his constituents there to present him a petition to take a position diametrically opposed to what he had stood for publicly and vigorously his whole career. I have never seen anyone more cordial, more respectful, more committed to a dialogue and a discussion about a really difficult issue than I got to sit in and watch Senator Mitchell have with the Old Town Knights of Columbus Ladies Auxiliary that afternoon. And I think that says a lot about how we do this work really matters, and the way we model civility with each other can have a lasting impact. Thanks for having me, and I'll shut up now because I know you're desperate to make this more of a dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Time for questions?
I put them all to sleep. Come on. So, who's the rabble rouser? There's always a designated rabble rouser.
I got a question. You talked a bit about encouraging immigration or trying to get our share of immigration. I assume you mean from other countries. Is there any strategizing about how to attract good people from other states? Or is that sort of play, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think it has to be both. And there's a newish effort in Maine called liveandworkinmaine.com. Check out their website. And I mean, their mission is broad. It's certainly to attract talented people who are already in this country and not just people from abroad. So that it has to be everything. I think a lot of times we get bound up in this sort of navel gazing of, gee, it's about my kid or my grandkid staying in Maine. The reality is that if we make this a really attractive, compelling place to be personally and professionally, we're going to attract plenty of people who aren't our own kids and grandkids who want to be here. I started working on this issue in earnest, about that same time as some of these other issues back in the early 2000s. There's an effort called Realize Maine, and it's kind of a constellation of all these local groups in the state. There's one called Fusion Bangor that is a lot of the young professionals around this area. There was one called Mid-Coast Magnet that started up in Rockland, and there's analogs to them across Rockland, Portland, Sanford, you name it. And as we were doing that and pulling the data about what is the dimension of the brain drain, at that time we were actually getting a net positive back of in-migration around really more kind of the late 20s and 30s. And here's the kicker. 4 out of 5 people who moved to Maine in their late 20s and 30s were not from Maine. 4 out of 5 were not from Maine, at least in the sense that they had not gone to a Maine high school. They might have had some connection to this state, whether they summered here for years or whatever it was. But they weren't the prototypical, my kid or grandkid who graduated from Maine high school and I desperately want them to come back. So it's got to be a broad-based message. I agree with your premise 100%. Yeah.
So I guess I was thinking about this in the context of the forest industry, and I mean, from what I've heard about it in the discussions I've had, everybody does think about it as this industry that's dead and is no longer. I had no idea how big it still was, but I feel like a lot of these things kind of come down to the sort of interface between public opinion and how politicians respond to it. Because I mean, they need to reflect the public's voice and their opinions on these issues. So I guess I'm wondering, throughout all these different projects you've done, what sort of overarching things you've noticed that help to, I guess maybe not necessarily change the public's opinion, but maybe increase information or really just make things happen when they, $8.5 billion industry, people need to know that.
Yeah. It's still true that there's no substitute. Seeing is believing. So it's one thing to tell them it's an $8.5 billion thriving industry, but then when they go see the mammoth scale of the Sappi mill over in Skowhegan, we're going to try to actually take them on a short field trip to see the R&D facility at the Sappi mill in Westbrook. And so I think, that doesn't substitute for having the evidence and the data, but I think it helps you internalize, right, and appreciate and bring tangibility to the evidence and the data if you also can see and touch some portion of that big thing that you're trying to use data to describe and move the needle. It's not easy, make no mistake about it. I mean, it was interesting observing some of the reactions on our legislative bus tour there can be a confirmation bias, right, where people only see or hear the things that confirm what they already believe. I think that's the exception, though. I mean, I think those are the outliers, even in a group of folks who have run for office because they have strong beliefs in something, right? But I think a lot of them are eager to learn, and they frankly don't get that many opportunities to learn in kind of a politically unfiltered environment. So I think you have to show people and not just use the data. Yeah, Linda.
So I imagine a lot of the people here would like to be you.
You should. It's a great job.
And if you look at the students now and you think about what kinds of experiences should they try to have so they're prepared for the kind of leadership you're providing, what would you recommend that they think about doing?
It's a great question. I guess one of the great truisms is that the best path to the next job is to do amazing work at whatever job you're in now. So if your job is being a student, you got to nail it. If your job is being a summer intern, you got to nail it. I think I've had my share of scut work introductory jobs. Actually, I used to love working on an organic vegetable farm in the summers, by the way, parenthetically, because I got to use my hands instead of my mind. So it can be about different kinds of experiences. And that was where I learned microeconomics, because we were trying to sell out the truck by the end of the morning, but not sell it out too quick, because if we sold out too quick, that meant we had set the prices too low. So you want to learn microeconomics and where the clearing point is, where the supply and demand curve crosses. Be in small retail, like a farmer's market, okay? So you learn things everywhere, I guess is one observation. But you also learn it by being an uncomplaining, tireless, and great performer at no matter what you're doing, even if it's photocopying pages out of the congressional records so that some other staff person can write a reply to a constituent letter. Now you don't have to photocopy, it's probably all digital, but in my day, that was the classic grunt work of your summer job, was photocopying and carrying the mail around these large organizations, right? It pretty much sucks. But you really impress someone, like in my case, working in Senator Mitchell's office. If you impress enough doing the photocopying and taking the notes, then it happened that when a staffer was out sick, they said, hey, would you fill in for a couple weeks for that staffer? And it's little things like that, right? That you're just the building blocks of the next step that you don't even know when it can transpire. I guess the other thing I always say is you've got to be truly relentless in networking, in building connections, in finding mentors. And so like when I was looking to come back to Maine for my summer job in law school, and like in a lot of fields, if you're a first-year student in a particular grad field, it's especially hard to get a good job in your field because they can pick from more experienced, grad students. So I probably sent my resume to 180 different attorneys in the state, most of whom I had never met. Anybody that had my alma mater, anybody that had an interesting sort of blend of public policy in their background, anybody that just seemed interesting to me. I sent 180 and I wound up, I think, doing about 40 informational interviews and got 2 job offers out of it. So I guess if there's one defining feature for me that's always been critical to my success, it's being truly relentless in kind of creating those opportunities. And a lot of people want nothing more than to help out a really talented young person who's in Maine. And they will somehow make the time to have coffee with you or to refer you on to the next person or to advocate for you. Many great jobs in Maine, even with online jobs boards, are never advertised. One of the jobs that got me where I am today was one of those, that first year summer job, and I worked for Peter Mills at a small law firm in Skowhegan, Maine. Peter Mills now runs the Maine Turnpike Authority. He was one of the most influential state senators in the Maine State Senate, and he was the one who got me a job interview with Angus King. And I didn't know him from Adam other than we shared an alma mater, and I made him meet with me, and he said, well, the great thing about running my own law firm is I can pretty much do anything I want. How'd you like to come work for me 3 days a week next summer? And that job was never advertised anywhere in any internship program around. So, I mean, that's the kind of mentality you have to just like shake those trees. I used to say it's not like opportunity doesn't grow on trees. You actually have to plant the trees yourself. Is how it really works.
Well, I think we're up at 4 o'clock. If you have questions you want to ask, come on up, but I want to give people time that need to head out, so let's thank Yellow again.
Thank you.